Welcome to the Burn Bag Podcast. My name is Gonawela. I am happy to be joined by Ian Bremmer. Ian Bremmer is an American political scientist who is the founder and president of Eurasia Group, a political risk research and consulting firm. Ian is also the founder of G0 Media. Ian's work speaks for itself, but he is credited with bringing political risk to financial markets, creating Wall Street's first global political risk index, and for establishing political risk as an academic discipline. Every year, Ian and the Eurasia Group release a top risks list, an annual forecast of the political risks most likely to play out over the course of the year. And we've had Ian now 3 years in a row to talk about these top 10 risks of each year. So Ian, we're so glad to have you here this year again.
Sure, good to be with you, man.
Thank you. So Ian, how do you assess the top risks of 2023 as compared to the top risks in 2022? This may be a flawed question, but are we looking at a more tumultuous year or less tumultuous, particularly for the United States?
Yeah, well, I would say that the tail risks are much more dangerous. In other words, the potential for the entire geopolitical order to come off the rails clearly much higher, and that is significantly driven by the number one risk in our report this year, which is a rogue Russia. It's the most powerful rogue state in our history. And on the back of an enormous misjudgment made by Putin to invade Ukraine, which was a concern back last year in the top risk list. They made it into the top 5, you'll remember. But still, the hope was that they could be dissuaded, pressured into not invading. And if they did invade, it would just be a smaller piece of Ukraine, so it wouldn't lead to this creation of Putin as a global pariah. He went all in, and he failed desperately. And there's no way to get him back to the status quo ante. And that's a huge problem. So we have, unfortunately, the number one risk that we are facing right now is by far the biggest danger of any top risk since we started this process decades ago. More broadly, the global economy is, of course, doing better. It's looking towards a relatively mild recession, or perhaps none at all, as we've seen with most recent IMF figures just in the past hours. The fact that the United States and other democracies are showing themselves to be more resilient than a lot of the headlines would have blared over the past year definitely gives you some cause for at least less pessimism, if not quite more optimism. So, I mean, if you take, the entire thing as a whole, there are plenty of places where we can say, yeah, don't panic. It's not crazy. But that number one risk is horrifying for all of us, and is frankly a more dangerous global environment than at any point we have experienced since the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962.
Yeah, this is terribly scary. I mean, last year, I remember your report had Russia as the number 5 risk, and as you say, rogue Russia, specifically harping on that word rogue, is your number 1 risk. And I mean, over the last year, Russia has by and large been humiliated on the battlefield, and the pathways to a Russian victory look quite slim these days. Sort of looking back now to 2022, did we have reason to be this optimistic about Ukraine's survival and the Western response this time last year?
Yeah, the answer to that is probably no, for a few reasons. First of all, because the Ukrainians clearly outperformed the expectations of the U.S. defense and intelligence establishment, as well as that of NATO. You will remember in the initial days following the Russian invasion at the end of February this past year, so many high-level officials were expecting that the Ukrainian government was going to fall within days to weeks. And indeed, there were proactive offers to Zelensky to evacuate him, to get him out of the country so that he would continue to survive. So clearly, there was no level of confidence that the Ukrainians would be able to hold the Russians off. Turned out that very fast movement by some technology companies like SpaceX in the provision of Starlink, so that Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines would be able to communicate despite the cyber attacks. Microsoft defending the Ukrainians in the cloud in a way that historically They would have been very vulnerable to the Russians. That made a big difference. Before NATO itself started taking a more proactive role in defending the Ukrainians. And then as the Ukrainians showed that they were able and willing to fight, then you started to see much more significant willingness of the West to provide that support. Even with all of that, the Russians came close to taking Kiev. If they had gotten that airport in the early days of the fight outside of Kiev, it's quite possible that the city would have fallen. And let's be clear, if the city had fallen and if the Russians had taken Ukraine, and if Zelensky was forced to Western Ukraine or out of Ukraine altogether, or if he had been killed in battle or captured, I hate to say it, but the fact is that the West wouldn't have been as cohesive as it is today. I mean, all of these 10 rounds of sanctions you see from the Europeans, the tanks and the HIMARS and the Bradleys and the Patriot missile systems, that came over time because Zelensky has been so incredibly charismatic as a leader, able to deliver the message of a strong and resilient democratic Ukraine, as people have seen all of that fighting on the battlefield and fighting back against the Russians effectively. If it wasn't for that, I think the Europeans would have been a lot more split. I think the Americans would have, had less reason to continue to support Ukraine in the battlefield because they wouldn't have been fighting as effectively. So, I mean, Putin, for all of the enormous misjudgments and miscalculations he made, for the risk that he was taking, not just on his own leadership, but that of his entire country, he wasn't far off from having much greater success than he actually experienced.
I mean, at this point, though, what does Putin actually want? Is it as simple as saying he does not want to be embarrassed geopolitically? Is it something more? Is it a little bit more complex than that? And I also sort of wanted to know if you could elaborate on how Russia's rogue geopolitical behavior parallels Iran's rogue political behavior.
Okay, those are two very different questions. So we
Yeah.
should probably handle them separately, to be honest with you,
Mhm.
because I don't want to ignore them. They're both important.
Definitely.
And the first, which is that what does Putin want? Well, you said that Putin's been embarrassed on the battlefield. Frankly, I think a big part of the problem is that Putin has been embarrassed off the battlefield. It's that Ukraine has been unanimously invited to join the European Union, as has Moldova. It's that NATO is far more unified with thousands of troops on the front lines, border states, border regions with Russia, that the Finns and the Swedes are on track to joining an expanded NATO, that Russia's major pipeline delivering gas to Europe, Nord Stream 1 and 2, has been blown up, and we're not sure yet by who. We know that the Europeans are decoupling their economies from Russia, that Russia's sovereign assets held in the EU and Japan, hundreds of billions of dollars worth, have been frozen by Western central banks. I mean, this is all an unmitigated disaster for an economy that's only 2% of global GDP, even as Russia has the largest geographic landmass of any country in the world with extraordinary resources. What a failure that is for Putin, who exercises near complete control of his entire political apparatus. So he has nobody else to blame for just how badly Russia is underperforming globally, except for him. So, I mean, what does he want? Well, yes, of course, he wants to win in Ukraine. He wants this territory that he has annexed, but doesn't even control most of, on the ground in Ukraine. He wants the land bridge to Crimea. He wants Zelensky arrested or dead. But he also wants a greatness for Russia. Remember, he has said very famously that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical calamity in the 20th century back in 1991. He wants to recreate a great Russian empire. And he has arguably done more damage to ensure that nothing like that will ever come to pass than anyone imaginable that could have been leading Russia over the last 10 years.
So now the nuclear question. Could potential nuclear rattling signal irreversible escalation? I would like to believe that the threat of nuclear war is minimal, but we're hearing these nuclear threats. There is a potential of nuclear threats coming from Putin. What's your take on that?
Well, there was a period of time when the Ukrainians were taking a lot more territory, when the Russians had just announced their special mobilization of 300,000 men, which Putin had been dragging his feet on because he knew it would be unpopular at home, when the Russians were starting to talk publicly about a dirty bomb that they claimed the Ukrainians were planning to attack, that they had intelligence on that, which the West believed was a false flag threat from the Russians that would give them reason to engage in a tactical nuclear weapon being exploded against the Ukrainians. At that point, the White House was deeply concerned that the Russians were potentially planning a nuclear strike. And that was when President Biden directly warned the Russians repeatedly what the consequences would be. That's when the White House went and spoke with high-level Russians one-on-one and said, if you launch a nuke, the Americans will be directly involved in this war, not by proxy, not by weapons. The Americans will directly blow you guys up on the ground in Ukraine. And by the way, that probably includes things like Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet. So they were very serious. And since then, the battlefield has stabilized somewhat. And since then, the Russians haven't been talking as much about the nuclear saber rattling. And so I would say that the risk is still far higher than you and I would find acceptable. I mean, 0 is acceptable. And I mean, I don't know if it's 2% or 5%, but there's a real possibility, but it's not imminent. Having said that, I do believe that Crimea, the control of Crimea for Russia, represents a red line for Putin. Now, does that red line mean that the Russians would destroy dams along the Dnipro and flood land that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians are living on and create an unprecedented humanitarian disaster? Might it mean the use of chemical weapons in the battlefield? Might it mean a tactical nuke? Might it mean asymmetrical warfare against NATO states, critical infrastructure, cyber attacks, espionage, targeted assassinations? I don't have a view on that. But clearly a level of significant step change escalation from the Russians, were that to occur, I think is something that we should take very seriously. And nuclear is a component of that. I mean, the problem is that Putin has every bit the same nuclear capability that the Soviets had back in the 60s when Khrushchev and Kennedy were facing off against each other. The difference is that Khrushchev and Kennedy could actually decide to de-escalate and could both retreat to roughly the same position of strategic parity that they had previously occupied before the Cuban Missile Crisis began. That's not possible for Putin. He cannot achieve anything close to where he was and where his country was back on February 23rd. And, you know, Andre, one of the things that you have to recognize here is that the Americans are trying to destroy Putin's regime. That is the intention, right? I mean, the economic sanctions are meant to critically cripple Russia. The military capabilities provided to Ukraine are intended to defeat the Russians in battle. Now, I think that there is perfect legitimacy and justification in doing so, given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But that does not change the fact that from Putin's perspective, NATO is trying to destroy his regime. And he doesn't think it's justified. He doesn't think it's legitimate at all. So if you've got this guy that, okay, he happens to have 6,000 nuclear warheads, but aside from that, he doesn't have an awful lot that he can use effectively as a threat against NATO, then you understand why he would be rattling the nuclear saber. And you also understand why even his friends, like the Chinese and the Indians, have been telling him, we really don't want you to do that, because they're concerned that it's plausible. They're concerned that we're actually heading down a path where we could be thinking about the unthinkable, and you want to cut that off well before it becomes a Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned China in that answer, so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to segue into your number two risk,
Yeah.
maximum Xi. So
Yeah.
last year, the number one risk was China's zero COVID policy. And throughout the year, I remember seeing news about the Chinese lockdowns in certain cities. And then, of course, more recently, these hospitals being overwhelmed and so on. And every time I'd see those tweets, I'd be thinking about your report. So however, today you say that Xi's grip on power is unrivaled since Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
So how did Xi fare in dealing with the blowback of the zero COVID policy? And did it affect his popularity or his grip on power at all?
I don't think so. But let's take a look back, because I mean, I remember, of course, when we put that top risk report out, and I felt very comfortable, we all did at the firm, that zero COVID, which had been enormously successful back in 2020, 2021, in allowing the Chinese to reopen their economy faster than anybody else. But the disease changed. It became far more transmissible. And China's ability to maintain effective policy with zero COVID was weakening and weakening and weakening. And there was no willingness to accept that. None, zero. So it was clear to us that it was going to fail. And the Chinese government and their state media apparatus was criticizing us at the beginning of the year directly. Eurasia Group, like, you guys are lackeys of the pharma companies.
There were cartoons.
And of the, yeah. And my view was, no, I want you guys to succeed. Let's be clear. Like, a failing China is bad for the world. It's bad for US. It's bad for our economy. Like, we don't want China to fail. We want you to get away from zero COVID faster. And they refused. And finally, they didn't refuse. Finally, they decided that they were going to move away from zero COVID, but they did it late. And unfortunately, they did it without proper implementation or execution. And this is the thing that represents the 2023 risk, is that historically, you know, we may disagree with a lot of decisions that are made by the Chinese government, but they have been strategic, they've been well thought out, and they've been well implemented. Especially big decisions that are made directly by the Chinese leadership. And here's a decision, one of the most extraordinary sudden changes. You go from zero COVID to everyone gets COVID. I mean, literally, no more testing, no more lockdowns, you know, let it rip. And they didn't adequately plan for therapeutics. They didn't, and they could have. They had months, but they didn't get them in place. And so suddenly, you know, Pfizer gets Paxlovid, like, literally approved with the distributor, like, on the day, and they don't have the ability to get them in place. So it's all being sold on the black market, some of it for $5,000 a pop. And the Chinese people are angry on social media, and they're like, these rapacious Western companies. And so then the Chinese government suddenly has to, you know, pivot to using Chinese therapeutics that aren't as effective, and Eastern medicine that, you know, really doesn't work. And so, like, Xi Jinping got it wrong. The policy was correct, but he didn't implement on it, because his response was a sudden knee-jerk, capricious reaction to the demonstrations on the ground that weren't even that big. But he suddenly realized, okay, this isn't going to work. Now, my concern here is not the end of zero COVID. I mean, 1 million Chinese have probably died, and they're never going to admit to that. I think 60,000 is what they've admitted to, and they'll never come clean on that data. But once it blows through the Chinese population, they will be able to reopen. And we've seen with the IMF, expectations for Chinese economic growth are a lot higher this year as a consequence of that sudden pivot towards openness and maximum COVID as opposed to zero COVID. But what we see is that Xi Jinping's direct control, his consolidation of power after the party Congress, after the end of term limits, after the removal of so many of the competent technocrats in the senior levels of the Communist Party, instead to people that are just loyal to him, means that he can make bigger mistakes. And, you know, when Mao had that kind of power, China's actual footprint globally was much lower. China didn't have the same level of economic influence around the world. They weren't so interdependent with Western economies, so we just didn't care as much. But now we care a lot if China screws up. Now it really affects us. And so the impact of Xi Jinping with that kind of power, surrounded by yes men, not getting great information, not publishing as much data, that creates much more uncertainty and risk for China going forward. It's not a rogue state. We're not in a Cold War with China. We still want a stable relationship with the Chinese, but there's much more uncertainty about their trajectory. And some of that can be on the upside, like economic growth this year. Some of that can be on the downside. And that's new for China. And because China is so important, and because our top risks are ranked on the basis of likelihood, imminence, and impact. That's why it gets number 2.
Absolutely. And I mean, we can have a whole session on China, but I do want to get to the other risks in the report. You write for your number 3 risk, quote, weapons of mass disruption.
Yeah.
Quote, when the Berlin Wall came down, the United States was the world's principal exporter of democracy, but today the US has become the principal exporter of tools that undermine democracy, not intentionally, though. So, what are the key political and economic implications that advances in artificial intelligence and other forms of technology, those weapons of mass disruption, what are the implications that those will have, so much as to make it your 3rd highest risk?
Well, I mean, first, let's take a step away from the risk report for a second, just so you understand that I'm not overall negative about AI. I think it's important to recognize that the efficiencies and productivity gains that will come from artificial intelligence advances, which were going nowhere for decades, no structural impact on the global economy. And suddenly it's like a hockey stick, and everyone's downloading ChatGPT, and everyone's thinking about how new AI developments can affect our own lives, can make our own companies, our own jobs more effective, more efficient. And so literally anyone on the internet, anyone with a digital connection will have access to near global intelligence in a matter of months. That is an extraordinary gain in efficiency for global health, for distance learning and education, for responding to climate change, deforestation. I mean, the efficiencies that come from deploying resources globally when you have that kind of real-time capacity to assess what's happening in the world and tap into the best intelligence, that's extraordinary. We've never had that before. I'm very optimistic about that. But it's the top risk report, and that's not what we talk about. And, you know, in the top risk report, as we develop sudden new technologies, we don't yet have the defenses to ensure that bad actors cannot deploy those technologies in ways that can hurt us. We saw that with the internet. You suddenly get all these bad cyber actors, some governments, some criminals, some random kids, and causing all sorts of disruption with trillions of dollars of damage to the global economy because we don't have cyber defenses that are adequate. And it takes us years to realize that, build up cyber defenses, and prevent them from being able to continue to attack and attack. So much so that in Ukraine, there are actually adequate cyber defenses that can defend against Russia today, which is great. But when we talk about AI, when we talk about bots that can pass the Turing test, where you and I can't differentiate them in text from human beings, we talk about disinformation, we talk about influence campaigns, we do not begin to have the defenses to protect our democracies or our markets from those actors. And that is an incredible risk. I'll give you a small example. Think about the meme stock blow up with GameStop and how a relatively small number of Reddit members with bulletin boards were able to drive up investments into a stock that was fundamentally worthless. The fundamentals had nothing to it, created billions of dollars of wealth in a short period of time, and then all that money was lost. Imagine doing that with millions of AI bots that not only exponentially drive market moves, but also are able to characterize, to act as if they were members of that corporation or analysts in the stock market, effectively obscuring the fact that they are not real people. The impact that will have on stock markets, on corporations, on banks is unprecedented. And we will not respond to that effectively until after the crisis happens. That's a problem. And I can see this affecting all sorts of interactions presently that rely on a level of trust and normalcy and expectations of behavior. We're going to be inserting delegitimization of those actors at unprecedented scale. That's coming within months. It's not years.
So, Ian, we've talked about war, we've talked about conflict, political chaos. and now technology. But I feel like everyone's concerned about inflation. Our wallets are concerned about inflation. My wallet, my parents' wallet, everyone's concerned about inflation. So how severe do you think inflation will be in 2023? Do we have reason to believe it will ease? And I guess how does that sort of play into the risk of a national or global recession?
Yeah, well, it is easing somewhat, and we've seen that most recently with numbers in the United States and Europe, in part because interest rates have been being pushed up by the central banks, and we now see a little bit more comfort that they don't have to go as fast, as quickly as a consequence of that. We've seen that from Powell, we've seen it from Lagarde, we've seen it from others. The fact that the baseline of the developed market economies is comparatively solid. U.S. unemployment is very low right now. Wages for the under and middle classes have significantly improved through the pandemic because of the nature, the unprecedented nature of the fiscal stimulus that was provided to those populations. This wasn't just bailing out the bankers and the big corporate CEOs. It actually was money that went to everyone. Savings rates went up as a consequence. That led to more consumer spending, which helped lead to the overheating of the economy, which is now getting you the inflation. So in a sense, it was, government created, and now government's trying to rein it back. The big challenge you have is that in economies that are not as robust, with dollar-denominated debt, that are also dealing with demands from their populations for more fiscal support, and they don't have the space. And so this is a much bigger threat for Latin America. It's a much bigger threat for countries like Egypt, for Turkey, for Sri Lanka, for developing countries that just don't have the space. And the IMF is not going to be able to give them the kind of money they did with the special drawing rights in the middle of the pandemic. It's going to make them angrier. It's going to lead to more populism, anti-establishment sentiment among their government leaders. And if they don't do that, then they'll be kicked out and new leaders will come in that will. And it could lead to financial crises in some of those countries. You saw a little bit of this in the UK, which is underperforming all the developed countries. And when Liz Truss came in and said, no, I'm going to reduce taxes and spend more money, which is exactly what the population wanted, the markets destroyed her. Because in a high inflation environment, they just said, we're just not going to extend money to you guys because you're a bad bet. And she was forced to completely do a 180 on those policies within a week. And then she was forced out within 4 weeks. And that's unprecedented in the UK. So you see the pressures that come from that level of inflation if you are comparatively poorly governed in a challenging economic environment.
So I want to jump to your sixth risk now because it sort of ties into my wallet question, the energy crunch.
Yeah.
I mean, gas prices, right? Everyone's thinking about gas prices. Do we have reason to be optimistic about global fuel prices? Well, the United States has had high gas prices. A lot of other countries that have massive hikes in fuel prices. How bad could the market get this year and why?
So I'm a little bit more optimistic on the inflation issue because I do think that the economy is going to perform better than people expect for some of the reasons we discussed. The flip side of that is greater than expected Chinese growth. The United States narrowly avoiding a recession, Europe maybe narrowly avoiding a recession, the UK having one. All of that implies that you're going to have more demand for energy in the second, third, particularly fourth quarters. That demand is expensive. It drives prices up, especially when you have price cap now on Russia. And the gap between that price cap and what oil is actually going for is going to make the price cap less attractive for the Russians. They may take more oil off the market, not to mention the fact that more pipelines can be blown up in this environment, right? So and the Iran conflict, which also means there's more Iranian energy that might end up off the market. So you take the economic optimism for rebound in 2023 and the geopolitical challenges specifically around two of the biggest energy producers in the world, Russia and Iran, that implies higher energy prices, which again, the Americans can pay for and to a certain extent benefit from because the Americans are exporters. The Europeans are doing everything they can to focus on transition away from Russia, greater efficiency, LNG from other sources, from the US, from the Qataris, all the rest, and they can afford to pay for those that otherwise would get really, really squeezed here, the middle and working classes. What's going to happen to the developing world? They're in big trouble. So both of these risks really hit the non-commodity producing, non-energy producing emerging markets around the world.
So, Ian, this year, US political chaos, which you define as the divided states of America,
Number 8,
comes in at risk number 8, which
low.
surprised me because
Yep.
it was much lower than it was when we did these episodes in 2021 and
Yep.
2022.
Yep.
So, I mean, do we have as much of a reason to be optimistic this year about our own country's political stability than before, and why so?
Well, first of all, there is a conceit with the top risks that we're just looking at 12 months. We're not looking at 5 years, 10 years. And so the fact that the US is still very politically divided, very fraught, many Democrats and Republicans see members of the other party as their principal enemy as opposed to people outside the country, that's a horrible place to be. 40% of Americans still think that the election was stolen by Biden against Trump. Same numbers as we see in Brazil against Bolsonaro today. None of those things make us happy long term about the state of American democracy. Very dysfunctional, very divided. But if you're looking at 2023, this is a political system that has just had a very significant amount of legislation get passed, including, surprisingly to many, the Inflation Reduction Act, misnamed, but nonetheless very important for stimulus and subsidy in the United States. The CHIPS Act, industrial policy, a lot of inshoring, a lot of greater investment into the United States, much more capital, some more jobs, in a very low unemployment environment, in an environment where wages have come up. On top of midterm elections, where not only did Trump's candidates underperform, but particularly all the people that were running for Secretary of State and governor positions in swing states where they would have had control of the elections in 2024, those election deniers lost. So the level of sudden, urgent 2023 political dysfunction has gone down. Now, it's still on the list. And it's still on the list in part because the U.S. is the only superpower globally. So anything that's a risk in the U.S. is higher than from other countries. But it's also still on the list because you still see, the debt limit is going to be a very serious political problem for the U.S. to get through post-June. Because, McCarthy, after 15 votes to become the Speaker of the House, has a tiny, tiny majority in the House and will be removed if he tries to create a compromise or concession with the Democrats to get the debt limit resolved. And so you are going to have a problem where the Americans are going to be, at the knife edge with potentially defaulting on some of their obligations later on in the year. And that's a deep embarrassment for the U.S. political system. It undermines American political strength globally and the ability of the United States to lead by example. So you can't have that kind of dysfunction and have the U.S. off the list. But it's nowhere near what people were saying back in January 6th, a couple years ago, when you literally had Americans saying that, there could be a coup. This could be the end of democracy. Like that's just not credible. And so the number 8 risk is also a very blaring don't panic sign to people that are reading this as opposed to listening to their crazy uncle.
Yeah, absolutely. So the number 9 risk sort of raised my own eyebrow because I am a Generation Z, or as I like to refer to it, a Zoomer. Gen Z is your number 9 risk. Simply, I guess, why? Why is my generation a risk?
Well, I mean, keep in mind that what's a risk for some is an opportunity for others. What risks are all about is when they create outcomes that are other than what you would have normally expected. Right? Because every single risk we talk about, we can find winners and losers on the global stage, right? So when we talk about TikTok boom and what Gen Z means, this is a group of people in the West that are unprecedentedly diverse, unprecedentedly progressive, and also unprecedentedly online. And they really believe that they have a voice that matters. They believe that activism is more effective at the individual level than voting. And so as a consequence, they are much more willing to challenge the status quo, challenge the establishment, whether that's on woke capitalism, for example, and social and educational principles, or whether it's on climate change and saying, no, we're not investing in you. We're not even buying your products unless you decide to take our issues on as primary. Now, part of the problem, of course, is that in a country like the United States or even Canada, where you've got red populations and blue populations that are very different, but you've got companies that operate in all of those places, it's increasingly impossible for them to satisfy the demands of those constituents. And so if you do what Gen Z is demanding, you're alienating other members of your core constituencies. And this becomes a no-win for a lot of these corporates. They don't want to see it. But it also means that you're driving forward an agenda that for a lot of people has been ignored for many, many years now.
So one of my last questions, I guess, is, over the course of this episode, we've covered a lot of risks. We've skipped some risks, particularly on Iran, and then arrested global development audiences. I urge you all to read the full report and read those risks in particular. But your 10th risk is something that many folks don't often really think about in a geopolitical sense, but it's still huge. Water stress. Oh, Ian, what is this risk?
So we talk so much about climate change. Finally, we talk about energy transition. We've got the COP process that actually has net zero targets for carbon and methane into the atmosphere. And every country pretty much around the world is moving more quickly to try to figure out how to decarbonize, when to decarbonize, so that we have less carbon in the atmosphere and that we don't have as high a change in temperatures around the world and the trillions of dollars of damage as a consequence. We've got COPs on biodiversity. We're finally dealing with biodiversity targets. We're trying to ensure that there's more safe areas for nature and for not having more extinctions of populations, the damage that will do. Water has not gotten that level of attention at all. Water is not treated as a structural problem. It's treated as a crisis that pops up. And when it does, we need to respond. Cape Town's going to run out of water. Okay, we're going to really crack down there. Then we deal with it. Now it's okay. Colorado, same story. Australia, same story. But what we're finding is that actually water is becoming every bit as much of a structural condition where we are going to be globally far more water stressed and some areas far more water overwhelmed. And that means you can't respond to it as a crisis because it'll create massive inefficiencies. You actually need ministries that focus and departments in your government that focus on this. You actually need new policies that change the way you use water on an ongoing and regular basis. It isn't happening yet. So the costs of missing that boat is going to be very significant, and it's really starting to hit in a structural way now.
So Ian, my last question in our last minute or so,
Yeah.
What are some of the key red herrings that you wanted to highlight for us this year that did not make the top 10 list?
Well, one big one is that we're not going to see a fight over Taiwan in the near term between the Americans and the Chinese. There is a floor under U.S.-China relations that is largely underappreciated because of the interdependence of the two countries. It's not a Cold War. And so despite all of the fighting in dual-use technologies that have military and economic purposes and uses, we're actually seeing much more high-level interaction between the United States and China that creates more stability in the relationship. And furthermore, every U.S. ally, as much as they want to ensure that they're part of the U.S. security umbrella, they don't want to be decoupled from the Chinese. So that creates stability there. Another thing I would focus on is just the fact that democracies around the world have ultimately more stability and resilience than people think. We discussed this a little bit in terms of the U.S. after January 6th, Brazil after January 8th. The European Union is politically stronger today than more cohesive than at any point since it was founded. Energy policy, defense policy, health policy, fiscal policy, tech and data policy, much more cohesive. 27 states, all with different interests, all voting together. Why? Because of the response of crises, because of Brexit, because of the pandemic, because of the Russian invasion, because of the global financial crisis. The European Union recognizes they need that capacity. So even with Macron feeling weaker with his majority in parliament, lots of demonstrations, Schultz with a three-party coalition that moves in different directions. Despite that, the EU is stronger than it has been before. Those experiments in democracy turn out to not be about to imminently collapse.
So Ian, thank you so much here for joining us today. For our audiences, you can follow Ian at Ian Bremmer on Twitter. He's very active on social media. His tweets are great. We'll be having a link to the top risks report in the description of this episode. So folks, please read the full report, top 10 risks, some of which we did not cover, particularly Iran and so on. But Ian, thank you so much here for joining us today.
Hey, good to be
for the
back,
third
man.
year in a row. Thanks.
Sure.